So today, I want to dedicate an entire who knows how long episode to the concept of the rep and reps in general, because reps are something that has just the topic has sort of sat underneath of so many different episodes that we've done. And you are kind of in, we'll say, the middle of like just a continued exploration of reps and volume and intensity and all those things sort of together in terms of the volume load discussion. So that may be something that's interesting to touch on. Um, just sort of at some point along the way. Obviously, who knows what direction it could go. I actually have some things written down here because I think that this is a topic that can be so broad that I just definitely want to make sure that we cover the major bits, and then if we can start to go off the rails once that's done, that's totally fine. Just starting a little bit more broad. And speaking from a personal training perspective, um, I think that something that's interesting to start out with is just the concept of like how important people think that the number of reps in a set actually is. Like I find that actually to be pretty fascinating. And I find that to be something that's more common in people who aren't as trained to worry about, am I doing 10? Am I doing 12? Am I doing 8? If you tell me to do 12 and I got 11, like was the whole set a waste, that kind of a thing. So from a personal training experience, I'm sure a lot of people who are coaches will relate to that. And I think that's an interesting point to sort of start from, which is just this concept of how much importance we've put on this topic to begin with, and sort of what that has done to, I think, exercise as a whole is somewhere more broad that's interesting to begin with. So just from my side of things, something that I was thinking about in relationship to this was just, you know, most people I think of a rep, they have a visual of an exercise, and a rep is a specific distance and two specific points in space within which people are bouncing. So if it's a bench press, it's like one rep is where I get to touching my chest and then where I get to locking out my elbow. And if I'm doing something that isn't in accordance with what I imagine that rep to be, then all of a sudden there's this sort of confusion around what am I actually doing? Uh, is this a partial rep? We just even the fact that we have the term partial rep is I think in and of itself something that kind of speaks to this as a whole. And so I kind of wanted to start from that perspective of just like why do you think it is maybe that it's 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 a topic that I think can be really, really simple in some ways, and then also it has this potential to just completely derail people's experiences in the gym, and as a consequence, lead them in directions that really, I think, don't really move the needle from a progress standpoint, sort of worrying about this kind of a thing. Do I do 8? Do I do 15? Do I do 20? Is this rep range just going to build me strength? Is this rep range just going to build me muscle? Is this rep range for toning? All these different kinds of things. So just I'm interested just to kind of see where your brain goes with that first off, and then we can kind of maybe hone in on a specific avenue that you find interesting after that.
Yeah, as you were describing this topic, I was thinking through my clients and which ones actually ask for the number of reps and which don't. And at this point, all but one client, and then maybe two, three, for certain situations, don't really pay attention to the number of reps. So either they're not counting them at all, and maybe I'm recording them just to track progress over time, um, or um, they kind of have like we have a broad idea like of the rep range that we want to be in, and then again, like maybe once we get outside of that, I'll increase the weight. But I think it's mostly on the trainer. I think it's mostly how we frame it. I find that if you start with a new client and right off the bat, you just don't frame like the number of reps, number of sets, like, as a primary factor. Of course, not everyone is coming in completely fresh. Like we can get people with some, with some pre-existing biases, people that are, a little bit more trained. And as you know, that can be tougher, working with someone who has a strong history versus someone who doesn't at times, as far as shifting their paradigm. But yeah, I even found, because historically I would have told people, do this number of reps, and then I would have sort of done like a built-in progression where, either I'm like increasing a certain amount of load or I'm trying to get them to do more reps the next week. But as I've moved away from that over time, I've found that it's not necessarily that difficult to teach your clients to do that as well. So when I think of the situations where I'm not doing that, it would just be a situation where someone's main focus isn't entirely on the quality of their session, and it is some sort of mix between like a social experience and like, training maybe makes up 50% of it. And in that case, like hopefully you're working with someone who's has reasonable background as far as like execution. Like it looks pretty good on a surface level. They understand the fundamentals of, how to not make a rep look like shit. And you're just kind of saying like, yeah, this is good enough. And then if, something comes along, like maybe make tweaks there. But there in reality, in every situation, we're stopping at some point and saying this is good enough. Like even at the highest levels, there's, an acceptable, um, an acceptable level of, good that you're trying to get to. And that just scales based on the person's goals, based on like what the, how hard, how much attention they want to put on something. Like I was training someone yesterday, and, this idea of like manipulating resistance profiles came up, and we started talking through like the different implements we can add to the machine. And like every time you do that, it takes a little bit more time, right? Like, with the hip extension, I have the weighted vest. And that takes a good, 10-15 minutes all in all to just like load the back of the vest if someone else is using it before, drag the vest back and forth. Same thing when we do the leg curl together. I'm like taking off the back of the machine and pin loading it, and then you have someone else helping you with it. So there's definitely levels, to just like, uh, how much you value the individual rep. You sort of have to choose, the sort of cost benefit of doing something like that. But that's all to say, from a personal training standpoint, I'm just kind of um, I think it is more so on the trainer, and how they frame it. It isn't. I don't think it's just this set in stone thing that all people inherently value the number of reps they're doing.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And two sides of the extreme here. I think that overall, a big part of the reason we are attached to reps, much like we get attached to looking at these other variables to some degree, is just to gain a sense of control. And I think that when people are new to lifting or new to personal training, there is this tendency, especially just speaking from experience as a trainer, where you want to you want to communicate with your client in a way that shows that you're confident about what you're doing. But interestingly, I find that the more than likely the least confident trainers are the people that are most certain about um, what amount of reps that their client is about to do. So if the client says how many reps they're going to do, and you say, oh, 15, like absolutely, we're going to do 15. Obviously, of course, there's context to like how that scenario comes about. It could be different if you're training someone for, 8 years and like, you've been tracking their progress. Like I know you pretty much know to a T is some of your clients, like how many reps they're going to do and whatnot. But most of the situations that I have witnessed specifically in myself and in other people, in that specific context, I don't get the sense that the trainer has any awareness around like I guess the problems with sort of framing things that way. Like it's just something that to them exudes a degree of confidence, and I think that to people who are in the population where they're getting trained by people, I think that they like that. They like to hear that kind of thing. They like to for their trainer to come off as confident. And so that's something that for both parties, I think is maybe good initially, but can become problematic when people start to become unusually tied to doing specific amounts of reps. And I've actually had people who legitimately feel like that, that set was a waste because, we said that we were going to do this amount when in reality I did this amount. So over time, I have moved more and more toward the direction of just trying to be straightforward about like kind of what you were describing about communicating the importance of it and just saying something like, you know, I don't really know exactly how many reps we're going to do, which is something that counterintuitively I think is actually um, displays more wisdom and a greater sense of confidence is just like being okay with the whole investigation process and like and just communicating that you don't really know what's going to happen and that's fine and that's something that's part of the process and should be. Um, and what you do, I think, in that kind of communication is you allow the client to sort of see for themselves and to experience for themselves like what you're actually trying to get after in a particular set, right? You're not trying to make this specific number of reps the priority. You're trying to make the quality of the set the priority. You're trying to get them to identify maybe where they start to deviate from what, the ideal technique you're setting forth is. You get them to be a little bit more aware about what's actually happening with their body and what's happening around them rather than just, again, this arbitrary thing that, you've set forward for them. So I think that that's all really important to consider, not just in the context of personal training, but then also just you training yourself. You and I have talked about how um, just having a specific rep count in your head can sort of change the intent and potentially the outcome of a set. So I want to talk about that a little bit later. But one of the things that I did want to touch on first, just broad scopes now, is where we sit kind of on the spectrum in terms of like what is a practical recommendation and what are the sorts of upsides and downsides to either end of the spectrum of repetitions, right? So if someone were to ask me like broadly speaking, what sort of rep ranges do you use? It wouldn't be inaccurate for me to say anywhere from 6 to 20 on average, right? And where we fall on that spectrum for me is mostly like something of a practical consideration more so than it is like a scientific, this 6 reps will do this and this 20 reps will do this, although I'm sure there are differences. So for me, exercise by exercise that changes, but is the sort of 6 to 20 rep answer something that, again, very, very broadly you would subscribe to? And if so, what are the sorts of advantages and disadvantages to leaning maybe more toward the lower rep end of the spectrum and then maybe leaning more toward the higher rep end of the spectrum? Whichever one of those you want to kind of start with is good with me.
Yeah. As you were talking through that, like I can think of, other podcasts that have like talked this idea to death, to death. And I think that makes me likely to not, repeat some of the same things, thinking that people have already heard it. But at the same time, there probably are a lot of those concepts that maybe are, just pretty in at this point, like pretty ingrained for me that may be still, new to other people. So I'll try to touch on a few that are just like things that are relatively common practice that can maybe just get us started. So when we're talking about, what I guess the framing initially is just like what's sort of an effective rep range for hypertrophy. And, where does that question start? And at one point, before this was, directly looked at in the research, there were just some sort of base assumptions about like how heavy one needed to train. And I think historically, you've seen sort of the average rep range for bodybuilders being somewhere around 10 reps. So, when you say 6 to 20, it's not super far off, maybe a little bit lighter than sort of was the, average historical norm. So that has shifted, I think, over time towards saying that like, oh, we can actually use lighter loads and still be pretty effective. And not that people, never did that in the 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, but from, from living through the 90s and early 2000s and just from, talking to people before then, it seems like the understanding was really that somewhere around like 70, 75% of 1RM, so something probably like under 15 reps is, where you're going to be most effective for hypertrophy, and that potentially lighter than that wasn't so effective. And we went through different periods of time where there was kind of a focus maybe on like the duration of a set. So it was like time under tension, and it's no longer maybe the load that matters, but it's the time under tension. There were there was also looking, at maybe like volume load. So just the number of reps you're doing times the amount of weight you're doing and sort of equating that. And that kind of came more from like an Olympic lifting and powerlifting background. And stuff like that maybe pushed us a little further away. Like as, bodybuilders started to look to the science and wanted to be a little bit more objective, like you said, there's always a desire to sort of latch onto something that you can measure. And sometimes it actually moves us further away from what we kind of already know to work. So when, kind of the nerdy bodybuilders got into looking at things like tonnage, which is, another way of saying volume load. So just trying to add up across the week. I did this many sets, I did this many reps with this much weight, how much total tonnage did I do for the week? Things like that. We, started looking for better and better proxies to sort of add up this, the ultimate question we're trying to get at, which is like how much stimulus have we achieved? And where that sort of practically settled somewhere in, we'll say the late, like, before 2020, after 2010, is this idea of like counting hard sets. And a hard set basically just meaning that you're reasonably close to failure. And then the investigation became what's close enough to failure and what's too light to stimulate hypertrophy. And studies started coming out comparing like uh, higher load, lower rep sets to lower load, higher rep sets, and trying to converge on what that range was. And, initially it's really hard to actually find a percentage that wasn't stimulative for hypertrophy. So even going as low as like 40 and 30% of 1RM, where people are doing upwards of 40 reps, you would see that it was still equally effective on a set per set basis to doing lower reps. And then the question is like, well, what's too low as far as reps go, and why might that be? There was really like a seminal study by Brad Schoenfeld that looked at like equating reps. So basically, like, I don't remember what the exact number of reps was off the top of my head, but it was organized something like a, you know, 24 total reps, and you could either do like 3 sets of 8 or you could do 8 sets of 3. And they found those to be equivalent for hypertrophy. But the people doing 8 sets of 3, were much more fatigued, both like orthopedically and, psychologically, emotionally doing that. And that kind of began the whole line as far as, in my head of investigating, all right, now what's kind of like the lower end? And I don't think, the upper end and the lower end are these hard cutoffs. It definitely matters, like um, things like training age, things probably like fiber type, things like, basically like the ability to deliver blood and oxygen to muscles. Like there are all sorts of factors that can shift this range. But the sort of general recommendation, like you said, is somewhere, you know, over 5 reps, less than 30 reps. The idea being if the reps get too low, that potentially there's just not enough like area under the curve as far as time goes to sort of, push that signal, like send that signal for um, what would be as stimulative as something that was higher than 5 reps. So it's not that it's not stimulative at all, but potentially that having a slightly longer set, whether that's, 5 reps, 6 reps, somewhere in that range, you start just having a sort of broader area under the curve. And as far as like how much force and across how much time are you producing that force? And then that force is sort of read in the muscle as tension, and that tension is communicated chemically and sort of starts that whole cascade of protein synthesis. So when they say the upper range being 20, it's not really that the upper range is 20 reps. It's really just that anything more than that can become a huge pain in the ass. So when we start investigating, like, what are the practical limitations of these ranges? That would be one example, is that when you get over 20 reps, um, one, people seem to just experience a lot of just like subjective fatigue, as far as like you can just imagine doing a 25 rep set of, especially with like a multi-joint movement like squats. There's a lot of metabolic fatigue. It comes with just a feeling of exertion that's much greater than doing something like 12 reps. And the other potential downside is as you get higher and higher with reps, it becomes difficult to estimate proximity to failure. You could think of it even as like a percentage, right? So if you were doing 10 reps and you wanted to, get 1 rep in reserve, you're guessing like kind of where your 90% mark is. So there's a little bit of margin there. But if you're doing, you know, we'll say 40 reps, now to guess, what your 1 rep in reserve is, there's 4 times the difference there. So it's like what you're at 97.5% or whatever. Um, so that's part of it. And also with that high metabolic fatigue, it just potentially skews the subjective feelings of effort and how close you are to failure. There's also evidence that you potentially need to be closer to failure when you get to higher reps to be as effective. So when you're just using heavier loads, whether that's like a recruitment thing in terms of being able to recruit high threshold motor units, I don't think it's completely clear at this point, but the idea is that heavier loads are a little bit more foolproof as far as like getting close enough to failure to be stimulative for a number of reasons, some of them being purely physiological and some of them just being perceived fatigue. And then on the other end of the spectrum with heavier loads, again, when those loads get really heavy, there's also this perception, like I mentioned in the Schoenfeld study, of a high degree of fatigue. People will call that neurological, whatever, sort of your thought is of the underlying mechanism. Both at very high reps and very low reps, you're dealing with different types of fatigue, whether they be, more metabolic in nature or whether they be more about just getting amped up and getting, especially when we're talking about axial loading, like putting load on your back, it comes with a different type of fatigue just lifting really heavy. So anyone who's done, powerlifting or, gone through phases of lifting really heavy, they know there's a different type of fatigue to show up and do, sets of 3 heavy squats than there is, to do sets of 15, say leg extensions or something like that. Now I'm comparing 2 different exercises there, but even if we were taking the same exercise and we said, all right, we get in a hack squat, for example, like you really got to get up, especially if you're a strong person. And like I said, there's a lot of sort of variables that can, shift the spectrum, and that can be one of them. So if you're a particularly strong person, getting under really heavy loads doesn't just have, this difference in like relative cost, but the absolute cost is just so much higher. And that might also have, orthopedic effects. Like I said, they definitely in the Schoenfeld study just found people had more aches and pains training heavier. And I think most people would agree with that subjectively. Just when you're chronically training with really heavy weights, you tend to feel a little bit more beat up.
Yeah.
So those are some things that just like immediately come to mind as far as like what's the spectrum of reps we tend to train across. What are some downsides of training heavy, some downsides of training light? Most people kind of find themselves somewhere in the middle. There probably is some sort of difference as far as like what the stimulus is. but that hasn't really been elucidated yet. At this point, it's kind of looked at as, both stimulate hypertrophy to a fairly equal degree. It's not totally clear whether that hypertrophy is coming through different mechanisms or not. So at this point, they're seen as equal, and most people would say train across a broad range of rep ranges to kind of cover your bases. But I would also say anecdotally, a lot of bodybuilders do not train across a spectrum of rep ranges. They tend to either stay in a specific rep range for all exercises, or for specific exercises, they use certain rep ranges, as you mentioned, just more practically. Um, they might use slightly higher reps for single joint movements, slightly lower reps for multi-joint movements. And there's usually some personal preference and some logistical concerns around like which exercises seem to work well for lower reps and which seem to work well for higher reps. But I haven't observed anecdotally that, changing rep ranges has a massive influence. And lastly, like there's some preliminary evidence that suggests maybe like throwing in some really high rep ranges and in addition to the lower rep ranges may have some unique benefits again as far as like um, getting a different type of stimulus that could potentiate muscle growth. But we're kind of just like scratching the surface of this idea of different rep ranges, different loads, different styles of training stimulating different adaptations. So I think even though for as long as I've been a part of bodybuilding, people have suggested train this way for this adaptation and periodize your hypertrophy training for these reasons. I still very much lean on practical considerations and fatigue management when it comes to designing a training program.
Awesome. So I think in that sense that, the practicality ends up being the thing to prioritize. And so, whether you land on the lower end of that recommended rep range or the higher end, I think should mostly depend on what the, we'll say, constraints of the exercise is. So, a couple examples to maybe get into, like, um, something like a dumbbell lateral raise, for example. I think that's a common one to use in terms of looking at like how progression maybe stalls. I don't, you don't see a ton of people doing dumbbell lateral raises in like the 5 to 7 rep range. I have, you have seen it before, probably. But generally speaking, you see those, a dumbbell lateral raise being done with anywhere from 10 to 12 to 15 to 20 reps. And generally speaking, that's an exercise that for a lot of people doesn't tend to venture into the heavier weight category. But then you have something like a shoulder press, like a barbell shoulder press, or a Smith machine, shoulder press or something like that. That in theory, if you just think about these different exercises as just like um, specific force directions from specific contact points, which call upon specific, orchestrations of muscle contraction, you wouldn't think that like there would be a huge distinction in rep range, but a lot of people then will say, 6 to 10 reps is good. And I've heard this like historically, 6 to 10 reps is much better for something like a shoulder press, a barbell Smith, whatever. Um, and then you change one aspect of that shoulder press, and now instead of a barbell or a Smith, it's now a dumbbell, and all of a sudden people are back to doing higher reps. So it's like it's it's kind of like I think that story kind of maybe illuminates some of the bullshittery around some of this stuff, but at the same time, it's kind of like, it's probably, and maybe it's saying something about each specific exercise in terms of like the qualities of the exercise and how that can influence the number of reps that we do. So I'm looking for your opinion on this, but my sort of a stance is like, generally speaking, broad scopes, exercises that there is one primary moving joint, but more specifically, one primary joint that's loaded, right? So for example, the difference between the Smith press and the dumbbell press is that your triceps are very, very limited in how much they can contract in a dumbbell press. for just uh, force scenario specific reasons, and they are not limited in something like a Smith press, right? So in exercises, generally speaking, where multiple joints can significantly contribute based on torque demand, I generally see people using heavier loads on average, and the opposite for the four scenarios in which one joint is primarily being loaded, which again, a dumbbell shoulder press doesn't seem like that to someone, but if you actually look at the forces of that exercise, it's mostly just a shoulder thing, and in the same way that something like a lateral raise might be, which is very interesting to think about in terms of the force rather than just what we visually see to be or visually analyze to be moving. So for you personally, in terms of this compound versus isolation conversation, do you sort of still lean toward that, or do most things for you sit on the higher end of the range? Because as we've discussed on this podcast and a lot just personally, you've obviously had some orthopedic stuff come up, and there are some people that say, well, if the exercise that you're doing is appropriately aligned for you and it's good, it's a good setup, then whether you use 6 reps or whether you use 15, orthopedically, those should technically be very similar. So, do you have some sort of disagreements with that? And yeah, just anything in relationship to your specific training right now, because we've also, just discussed like all the exercises that are in your program. So I think it would be cool to kind of harken back to some of those. But a lot of points just sort of thrown at you. The main one that I want to start with is just where do you on average see your sets being relatively lower rep and higher load? And then where, in terms of the specific exercises, do you see the opposite? Or do most of your exercises sit more toward the higher rep end of the spectrum right now?
I don't change rep range based on the exercise for myself or under most conditions. For me personally, I'm in the 12 to 20. Well, that's actually not true. Like a lot of time, I think on this podcast, I'll often say like I train, higher reps, but that actually misses a lot of the context. So I train maybe with a slightly lower percentage of 1RM than most people do. So my first set to failure is usually somewhere between 12 and low 20s as far as reps. Let's say the average was probably somewhere around 15. But sometimes, it'll be 11, sometimes it'll be, 22. Um, and the constraints that change that are mostly practical. It's just like how much weight can I load on a particular machine a lot of times. But let's say I go to failure, for a set of 15. And then again, my rest periods may depend on like, is this thing really systemically fatiguing? Am I supersetting it with someone else? Am I training with a training partner? But certainly by the time I get to the next set, like I'm not huffing and puffing. That could be anywhere from, minute and a half upwards to 3 minutes. A lot of times it's just I go, my training partner goes, it takes me a minute to, you know, put the seatbelt on or set up the handles or whatever the hell. So let's say on average that could be, 2 minutes. I'm not setting a timer in between sets, but I'm also not treating it like a powerlifting game. So I've done, 15 reps to failure on my first set, let's say. And then my next set to failure may very well be 11 reps. And then after that, it might be 8. And, most of the time I'm doing 3 sets, but if I did 4, then maybe it's 6. And if my first set was 12, maybe it's 12 and then it's 10 and then it's 9. So even though, I'm starting with a lower percentage of 1RM that, would equate to my 15 rep max versus, someone starting with 10, which would be a little bit higher percentage of their 1 rep max. I do work through various rep ranges just because of the fatigue that I accumulate. I think it'd be like I said before, we don't have a strong understanding at this point, at least not that I'm aware of, how, training with lower reps affects sort of the chemical signaling and the sort of ancillary adaptations around hypertrophy. When we say hypertrophy, that just means something got bigger, but it's, what got bigger? Are we talking about the actual muscle fibers? Are we talking about things, that people would call sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, which could be fluid related changes, but it could also be things like mitochondria, ribosomes. So there's a lot of stuff going on in there. There are also adaptations that don't necessarily acutely lead to hypertrophy, but may, potentiate future hypertrophy. This could be things like increasing capillary density, or it could be, the donation, of more. It could be like a satellite cell proliferation, or it could be nuclear changes. Like there are just lots of finer details that we haven't really been able to say, like, this rep range, this loading range, does this. And then, of course, we don't know how fatigue affects that. So would it be reasonable to say that, doing 6 reps to failure after doing 2 hard sets could have, could be the same stimulus as doing 6 reps to failure, right off the bat? When you throw on, a BFR cuff, when put on like a blood pressure kind of cuff around your leg, or you strap a knee wrap around your leg, and you cut off, some of the blood flow, um, coming out of the muscle, that seems to have some similar effects to training with heavier loads. So, when when you're basically artificially inducing fatigue, it's interesting how those adaptations kind of mirror what happens when you train with heavier load. Maybe it's the same case here, where maybe it's actually really productive if you want to train with slightly lighter loads to go to failure, and then let fatigue push you into those lower rep ranges. And then again, maybe you get some of the benefits, some of the practical benefits of training with less reps without having to use more load. I don't know, but I think it's a reasonable place to start if I already know that I'm going to train with a lower percentage of 1RM. So I think that more or less sums up, how I think about my training. And I'm sure there are lots and lots of details in there that we can circle back to. But the first part of what you said, you gave a few examples of a dumbbell lateral raise, a barbell shoulder press, and a dumbbell shoulder press. And I'll tell you, like, the sort of stuff that went through my mind when you were saying that. Specifically comparing like a dumbbell lateral raise to, say, like a cable lateral raise, or like a seated lateral raise machine. Um, I think that experience really differs a lot too. So just like I mentioned, if I'm, doing cable lateral raise, and I think yesterday, like, my first set was 12. So by my last set of cable laterals, maybe I'm doing 7 reps, and have absolutely no problem with that. And I think a lot of it does come down to, like, how stable the exercise is and what the profile is. And I think if you have something that's really heavy where you're weak, um, you know, when you condense it down to a small number of reps, you may just not be getting as much. You may just not have enough time to sort of accumulate reps that are stimulative in a more lengthened position. So it's like, at least if you have 20 reps, you can sort of, like, it's like working with, a fine tooth comb. Like, eventually you sort of get the, like, death by 1,000 pricks kind of thing. But if you have a super heavy, if you have a, relatively heavy load, and you're trying to do like a 5 rep set, again, if there's not a lot of stability there, you're probably going to use more body English. Or if you don't, um, you're just at the point where it's so heavy at the top of the rep, um, you know, as a percentage, like across the entire set, at least if you're using a lighter load, you can get to the point where by the end of the set, yeah, maybe you can't get to the top, but it's not right from the beginning of the set. So maybe there's some considerations there. Like I said, I found in practice that, especially when it's fatigue that's driving me into those lower rep ranges, that there's absolutely no problem with training lower reps on something like leg extension, like curl, lateral raise, bicep, tricep. Um, when we move into the barbell versus like the dumbbell example, one thought that I have is just like kicking up dumbbells, like the cost of getting the dumbbells into position If you're doing a 5 rep set, again, it depends how strong the person is, but at a certain point, it becomes disproportionate. I think just like, orthopedic costs can become disproportional as you get stronger, where it's like, there's a certain amount of recovery time that you need from a muscular standpoint, and there's a certain amount of recovery time that you need from like a connective tissue standpoint. And those two, can potentially vary and maybe become, more disparate at the extremes. Same thing here, where it's like, if you can if you can only dumbbell press, 25s for 6, your limitation is not necessarily being able to kick them up. But when you get up to, 200-pound dumbbells for 6, like, you don't necessarily get incrementally better at like a relative rate at kicking those dumbbells up, the same rate that you get to pressing them. So I think that's what you find a lot of times is a lot of things just become disproportional at the extremes, and some, sooner than others. So your little cat butt in the camera.
Oh, right in the camera. Yeah. Um, yeah, so and I think that also speaks to what we kind of started with, which is that the practical considerations sort of reign supreme a lot of the times, especially at the extremes. One other thing that I wanted to comment on, um, just to sort of make a point of it, is I think that so much of the basic physics stuff really ends up determining these kinds of things. So for example, like if you're gonna do a Smith press, and I have, a Smith press on, in my apartment, so I use it not infrequently when I do like a push day here or something. And you can set up a Smith press in a way that really, really only loads the shoulder. And you can also set up a Smith press in a way that loads the shoulder and loads the elbow pretty much equivalently. And those two things, in terms of the experience of the exercise, feel like the difference between a barbell press that's like a free barbell press and like a cable fly, where you can do it in a way where it's pretty much only like pec, all pec, depending on the range you use, depending on how you set up your forearms, right? Depending on um, the amount of reps that you are aiming for, and the range that you're using within that context. And so I think it's helpful not to think about these things as compound versus isolation necessarily, but more on a case by case basis in terms of the specific forces. And I'll point people toward our episode that we did, I don't know how many ago, just on compound versus isolation, if they want to maybe know more about that, because there are situations where something can look, quote, compound and be very isolated in a sense. And there are situations that may actually be set up so that they're supposed to be isolated, but that end up being quite compound, depending on, what people do in terms of body English or in terms of getting other joints involved. So I think all those things are important influences. But just to clarify, there are no exercises for you currently where you're starting out your first set in like 6 to 10 rep range, correct?
No.
Yeah. Okay. Same. Which doesn't mean that, that wouldn't be um, useful or potentially useful. I think that a situation where I could maybe see that being more practical, and this is sort of harkens back to the old powerlifting days for me, is just sometimes teaching people exercises is this process of finding the balance between using enough load to where they're constrained in some way by the forces of the exercise, right? You don't want to, I'm sure we've all, if any trainers are listening, given clients dumbbells for a dumbbell press that are way too light, and they end up just like basically flopping the dumbbell and doing whatever they want, right? You don't want that situation, but you also don't want the situation where you give the person a dumbbell and they go down and they can't get back up, right? So you need to kind of find a good balance between giving them enough load to where they're constrained in a force scenario, but also not so much that they, the second they move half an inch out of alignment with where you want them to be, that they all of a sudden just can't do the reps, right? Someone untrained probably has a lot of experiences like that. So anyway, using I would say like a use case for training in the 6 to 10 rep range, I think is maybe more practical in terms of like how people view training for strength, which is basically just doing sets that are lower effort in terms of reps and reserve that they can use as a strategy to actually progress a skill. So I think in terms of skill development, it's actually sometimes helpful to get more total sets in that are of a lower relative effort, so that people can maybe go into each set with lower amounts of fatigue. And for someone who's just starting out training, I think that, if they don't really have the ability in the first place to really push things in a way that is safe and repeatable, using lower ends of the rep range with, again, lower amounts of relative effort can be a good strategy for accumulating or just honing in a skill. And I think that that's something that people who are very advanced maybe just never really have to think about, just because it's like, you've either been training for so long or you've been doing the same movements for so long. There's no effort really that needs to be put into the actual skill acquisition component of it. But I think that that's a good application, or where I see application for lower rep ranges as opposed to higher rep ranges, assuming we're not, again, training to total failure. Because, I think a lot of people will immediately associate lower reps with higher weight and higher weight with more joint fatigue. And that may not be necessarily the case if, again, you're not doing sets that are super difficult. So I think that's another use case for that. One of the other things that I wanted to comment on was just this concept of rep range and its effect on quality, in terms of our intent to achieve a specific amount of reps. And we have alluded to this a number of different times, but haven't really covered it super thoroughly. Just kind of the concept of, looking at, let's say, like last week's rep count that you got, and trying to specifically aim for that or beyond that every single session, and how that may actually impact quality over time. So can you just talk a little bit about that in your experience in terms of just, projecting a rep range for yourself, and maybe what you would advise for someone who is sort of closer to the end of the spectrum of putting way too much weight on getting a specific amount of reps, and how that may actually be working against them?
Yeah, so I would say up until, man, maybe 3 years ago, because when you and I were training together after the like 2021 season, we were not specifically setting rep targets. I would say that was like in kind of around the time when I started doing that. So we'll say maybe 3 years or so plus. Um, I've been, not specifically, like I've had a range that I train in with sort of a double progression kind of model where I can look back and say, all right, now I've gotten 20 something reps. Let's go ahead and increase the load again. And sometimes it's a little more subjective where it's like, I've maybe I've been around the same reps for a couple weeks now. It's like 17, 18, 18. I'm like, you know what? Let me just increase the load next week and see if that kind of spurs things on again. I do think there's like something to, novelty as well. Like it is important, one, to sort of like very broadly just kind of frame what direction you're trying to move in. So like I will get a lot of consultations where people have just been kind of like basically coasting, just kind of like grooving the same well, not really having a specific direction, a specific training phase. And I bring this up, I bring this term like training phase up because like it insinuates that you're doing something different, something novel, and you have a plan. So I think on a super high level, like it is important to at least have, some direction, maybe something a little bit new. For me, the sort of newness has been more around like making the rep better. So exercise selection, exercise setup, exercise execution, and the constant exploration of increasing, the training stress through those means rather than just finding ways, to add more load or reps every time. But within that, on a more micro level, the load and reps are still progressing. But just kind of like still having that in mind that there should be something exciting, new, novel. There should be a direction. There should be a plan. And I think that's what a lot of like the set and rep progressions do is like you have a plan with a name on it. That's important. Like you have a coach who handed you, a spreadsheet. You have a new training partner. You have a new gym, whatever it is. Like when they take trained people, who are, it's not necessarily me or even you in a study, but people who, have been working out for at least a few years. Maybe they squat, 1.5 times body weight or something like that. And they go on what will be like an average 12-week study. The gains that they see in muscle growth from being in that environment are just vastly different from what we see in observation, in kind of free living conditions. So I think just framing that first, that like, yes, I'm talking about this sort of like auto-regulated approach where you're just sort of observing things happen versus, forcing them to happen. I do think there always needs to be some, I think it's always beneficial to have some framing of like a time period, a direction, and a goal as a starting place. But then within that, um, on a more acute level, if the rep is the focus, that making sure you fully appreciate that, and you can lose that if you try to necessarily like estimate what your progression should be. And it could be, it can be similar in any other example too, with saying like, I'm going to gain this much muscle, in this amount of time, where it's like, yeah, it is important to have, a goal, but just make sure that it's not so far away or so like unmeasurable or so out of your control that you're just like you're putting something on paper and valuing that more than the moment to moment and the day to day just like process of it. So being very process oriented means focusing on the thing directly in front of you, the moment that you're in, and executing that to the best of your ability, and then letting the outcome be what the outcome is, reflecting on that outcome, and then going back, and making changes. So, another example of an auto-regulated approach might be deloads, for example, where some people are like, well, I plan my deloads and I do them every 4 weeks or every 12 weeks or whatever your paradigm is. And then other people are like, well, why would I deload, if I don't need to deload? I'm just going to let that be, auto-regulated, and I'm just going to rest when I feel like I need to rest. And like many other things, usually somewhere in the middle and using a little bit of logic around it, can be the best approach. And that's kind of where I go with that is like framing, a training period, a training goal, and saying like, look, this is how long, we're going to jog for, how long we're going to sprint for. Like this is how long we're going to push something. This is the rate we're going to do it at, and it's defined by, how far we're trying to go and how long. And, then from there, all the decisions, sort of get answered going backwards. And of course, anywhere along the way, if the outcome is a little bit different than you expected, you're not so tied to it saying, all right, I created this plan on paper, but no matter what, I'm not going to deviate from it. You've created a plan based on looking at your prior results with the best information you have available, but then you're always willing to sort of make changes along the way. And the way that fits into like this whole, rep progression thing is again, you've set sort of like a direction and a speed that you're going at, and that may be defined by things like, this is the length of the training block, this is the goal of the training block, This is the total number of sets that I'm going to do across all exercises for a specific body part. And my expectation is that I can make it this many weeks without seeing performance, plateau or decline. And you may find that that happens sooner than you expect. You may find that, like, oh, based on my previous experience, I could make it 12 weeks without getting to the point where my performance declined or your sleep got worse or your, psyche, got to an untenable place. Like, whatever it is, that may fall outside of your expectation and you may have to change from there. But I think, on the smallest level of just, executing each rep perfectly and then reflecting back on it, you know, if you're doing the other things right, sort of outside of the gym to, the best of your knowledge at that time, the reflection should be in your performance. And it's not so much about forcing, the performance in that moment. It's about allowing the performance to show itself because of the recovery that you're getting outside of the gym, because of the quality of your exercise and the quality of your reps and the quality of your effort within the set. And then all of that is reflected in the outcome. You sort of have an expectation that, okay, I can get this outcome for X amount of weeks. And then within that, you will time to time find that, like, oh, I couldn't make it, quite as long as I thought, or maybe I can make it a little bit longer. And then you're constantly just kind of readjusting your expectations. And I think that, you know, that's a much more realistic way to go about things rather than just saying, like, I'm going to set like a predefined uh, progression. And, I'm going to get there come, hell or high water. And like I said, it's not that I would never do that with a client. Like, I'll still do that at times. I think, you know, we're usually talking about hypertrophy on this podcast. Like when we were talking about rep ranges and when I'm talking about this now, I'm talking specifically about hypertrophy and not about strength. Because that can really vary when you're saying, like, all right, instead of the goal being like, this sort of chemical signaling and this long-term, process of growth. Maybe it's like, I need to hit this, specific load, and maybe I can adjust, the number of reps I'm doing or sets or whatever, but the goal is the load versus like here we're being very specific about, the load is kind of a means, to an end. So yeah, I think that sums up pretty well, like my thoughts on a sort of auto-regulated approach or sort of a rep focused approach to progression versus like a predetermined load increase, predetermined, rep increase.
Yeah, so if someone just kind of moving toward practical recommendation and practical steps for people maybe that are looking to set a rep range and set that aim, so to speak, rather than to try to lay out a very particular progression. And I think this is interesting, by the way, the different, like the contrast uh in how people will progress on something like a machine. Like people, I think generally speaking are less emotionally attached to like moving the pin down on the stack or like um or something similar as compared to like using the next pair of dumbbells. Like using the next pair of dumbbells is a lot more exciting than like moving the pin a centimeter down for some reason. So I think it's interesting to see the differences just in terms of like client perception sometimes of like those changes, and I think that plays into the process versus outcome oriented conversation. But anyway, for people who are again maybe looking to find a way to set an aim, would you say that a good recommendation is to have a particular range in mind and to have a particular goal for effort in mind, and then to basically just observe the outcome that is the rep range rather than setting the rep range prior or the specific number of reps prior, sort of starting more from like hey, this is the zone that we're aiming for. If we're a little above or below this, that's okay. Let's just test and sort of retest and eventually wheedle our way toward what looks like an average number within a particular range, rather again than setting like the arbitrary three times times 10 thing. Would that be a good recommendation, just to start with a broad strokes guess? Maybe in your warm-ups, you sort of find your way towards a load that feels like it would be within that range, and then just observe the response rather than setting a particular and precise, destination.
Um, I think, when I'm describing my own programming, like each decision sort of begets the next decision. So when you're looking at like the total paradigm, it's based on each decision before that. So the place that I got to is only because of all the things preceding it. And it's not necessarily a recommendation for someone else, as it is just kind of like a thought experiment and just a way to think about, how you model your training. So for me to get to the point where I can say, all right, it's all about the individual rep. And I'm gonna have my most of my progressions be reps until a certain point, and then it's gonna be load. There had to be a lot of decisions before that. So even the decision like we talked about today of like, do you want to train with a lower or higher percentage of 1RM? Is your first set going to be a higher load or lower load? If you're starting with a higher load and lower reps, it's going to be harder to progress reps. It's going to just be a greater percentage change to move from 6 to 7 than it is from 16 to 17. So if you've made the decision to train with lower reps, that progression model is not going to work as well. If I'm describing training to failure, and when I do each set to failure, I end up working through the various rep ranges. But if you're not at a point where your execution um, is extremely proficient, training to failure may actually be negative from a fatigue standpoint and from an orthopedic standpoint, and maybe you're leaving a couple reps in the tank, and maybe then you end up with kind of a different model. It may be that you're you could take the stance of, all right, I'm going to leave 2 reps in the tank on every set, and then you'll actually see the reps go down, right? But then you have to every set be kind of aware of like, how many reps do I have left? How many reps do I have left? Or you could take the model of like, all right, I'm going to let the reps in reserve sort of descend throughout the set. So maybe I start with like 3 reps in reserve, and then by the end I'm at 1. But then again, you could just take that concept of not necessarily being focused on like trying to count the exact number of reps, or in this case, trying to estimate the reps in reserve while you're doing the set. And you could just take that concept of being very focused on the individual set and apply it to, a different framework. And you could say, all right, well, in this case, like I'm going to choose the amount of weight that I'm going to do ahead of time. And based on my previous week, I know that that should, not take me to failure. If last week I did, 100 pounds for 10 reps on the first set, and I still feel like I had a few left in the tank, like I could probably, go to 102.5 this week, and I probably won't be at failure next. You can make those kind of assumptions, and then, still working within the framework of saying like, all right, either I'm not going to specifically count the reps, I'm just going to stop, at a point where I'm reasonably close to failure. Or you could say, I am going to do a specific number of reps, but, because I'm not training to failure, I'm also not like pushing far enough where I might start to deviate in my execution. Right. So if you knew for sure that like, or you knew most likely that 102.5 wasn't going to be a failure, then I'm not quite as worried about you deviating in your execution by trying to get 10 reps versus last week 102.5 was to failure. And this time I'm going to force myself to get 11 reps, or I'm going to go 103 or 105 on the bar, and I'm going to beat my previous week. So you can still have like a pre-planned paradigm, and you don't necessarily have to train to failure, but just keeping in mind that concept of like the rep is the primary focus here. So if you are saying like, all right, I'm going to train to failure, but every single week I'm going to beat the logbook, I think that's where you potentially get into a place where your execution can change week to week. And it may not even be that it changes from the standpoint of it being like that it's worse orthopedically, but maybe you just move a little faster. You know, maybe now the eccentric is a little bit faster than it was, or you didn't pause as long, you know, in a given position. And then you have the perception of progress, you know, which is very motivating when in fact you weren't really progressing at all, versus the goal being, you know, to do each rep with, you know, particular constraints and let the outcome be what it's going to be. I think even when you do that, as you sort of mount fatigue over a training phase and you're kind of acutely aware of like, yeah, I usually get more than 15 reps here. I think there's always the potential for that to happen in terms of just slight changes, in terms of like all the various factors that could go into the, you know, the end outcome of how many reps you get. But I think, you know, coming back to the start of each new phase, you're always kind of regrouping, sort of dialing down the mental intensity and saying, all right, how can I make this as perfect as possible? How can I, you know, make this as consistent of a rep as possible? And then progressing from there. So I would say that yes, based on the decisions I've made, as far as like I'm going to start, you know, with a potentially lower percentage of 1RM. I'm not going to take, you know, super long rest periods. I'm going to continue to educate myself on like setting up the most perfect rep I can. I'm going to train to failure on each set. Based on all those constraints, I end up in the place I end up in. Um, but I don't necessarily think it's like a prescription that everyone else should train that way. I just think it's something to think about when, you know, you're framing your own training.
Yeah, and I think just to kind of um, wrap this up, I think a good final point to bring up is just, this is something that Tom brings up a lot, where um, he'll talk about how the people that are, we call the strongest people on earth, like the people that are putting thousands of pounds on a barbell, are the people that are harping the most about, technique and control of every rep. And I think that's a really interesting contrast uh to look at, because people who, like high level power lifters, Olympic weightlifters, um, they actually are the only people that when they deviate from their technique, they're much more likely not to progress. Whereas in many ways in the hypertrophy realm, because the relative loads and the exercise selections are less complex and generally relatively lighter, you can deviate from the technique and actually see an increase in output. Whereas, the guy who's bench pressing 700 pounds, if he moves, half a centimeter out of alignment with his typical technique, now all of a sudden you have this immediate consequence. So that's kind of like, the potential benefit of really just taking that and sort of running with it as a framework, which is that eventually you get to a point where when you deviate from the technique, you actually see some kind of outcome that you don't actually want. And the more that you become aware of that, the less I think that, the amount of reps that you get week to week will end up mattering as much to you, because it's kind of like, once you've honed in so specifically on the skill, you know what the skill feels like, and you know what it's like to start to move away from that. And so when you start to maybe get a little bit too weight hungry, and maybe when you start to execute things a little bit differently, but you are seeing that progress, again, in the outcome of moving the load, you can start to be more aware, week to week, of just when you start to maybe move too far in that direction. A good example that I wanted to just give personally, and how it can also be very deceptive too, is just moment to moment, especially with machines, like how specifically you're pushing, so something as simple as, like, if you're using a converging press machine. I was using the Nautilus press when I was down in Florida. I noticed that if I had the intent to actually push with the convergence, so like pushing inward and outward versus just treating it like a dumbbell press forward and backward, I could actually press substantially more load when I was just haphazardly pushing forward and backward. because from a frictional standpoint, you can get a lot more elbow stuff involved as compared to just the shoulder thing, which is kind of what I was alluding to with the Smith press example earlier. And so I think naturally speaking, uh, uh, people will gravitate more toward the variation that they can use more load on, when in reality, the technique that may be more appropriate for the goal is actually the one that you can use less on, because by definition, that load is being distributed through fewer moving joints. So, that's one example where maybe week one, you're really pushing in alignment with that convergence of the press. And, week five, you're still progressing. Week six, maybe you run into a roadblock and all of a sudden you deviate the technique this much in terms of the direction that you're pushing. And now you can add more load, but you're adding more load to something that was not actually the goal to stimulate. So, those kinds of things can definitely be subtle. And you can definitely also go too far in the direction of like being super anal about the technique. But I think usually when people start to get too anal about the technique, they're running into different problems than just, how many reps should I do? It's more of an overall framework, I think, issue. Um, so yeah, anyway, we could probably talk more about this in terms of the different um, skills that may necessitate different kinds of rep ranges, but I think that's probably a good place to kind of draw the line. Did you have anything else that you wanted to add to that? All right, sweet.